Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for our national anthem, sung by Master Sergeant Michael Martinez.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Please be seated. Please welcome the Mayor of Denver, Michael Hancock.
Thank you. Thank you and good evening. Let me first start by recognizing, don't go, Master Sergeant Michael Martinez for that beautiful rendition of our national anthem. Thank you, Master Sergeant, and thank you for your service to the United States of America. Absolutely. I also would like to take a moment to welcome some of our state leaders who are joining us this evening. Hold your applause, and then we will give special thank you to all of them at one time. I'll ask you when I read your name to please stand so folks can see you. U.S. Attorney John Walsh, Colorado State Attorney General John Suthers, Colorado State Senate President Brandon Schaefer, Colorado State Senators Ted Harvey and Tim Neville, Colorado State Representatives Nancy Todd, Bob Gardner, and Crisanta Duran, Denver City Council Member Jenny Robb, Arapahoe County Commissioner Bill Holen, Aurora City Council Member Debbie Holen, as well as all of the first responders from across the state of Colorado. Please give our leaders a hand. On behalf of the City and County of Denver, I'd like to welcome all of you to tonight's grand opening event of the Counterterrorism Education Learning Lab's newly redesigned exhibit, which I hope all of you have had a chance to see earlier this evening. Over the past 3 weeks, we have not only witnessed the extraordinary power and resilience of our communities during challenging times, but also the vital importance of our safety providers. As wildfires ravaged through our state, brave men and women from communities all across Colorado banded together to push back the flames and protect our citizens and our infrastructure. Absolutely. These men and women risked their lives for our community. 2 weeks ago, Denver police officer Selena Hollis was killed while trying to break up a fight during the jazz concert at City Park. Her death was a stark reminder of the sacrifices made by those whose goal is to protect and serve the citizens. While these events have shifted our immediate focus, they have also strengthened our resolve to do what is necessary to protect ourselves from these threats, both foreign and domestic. The greatest test in the 21st century will be defined by the ability of nations to work collectively to meet the continuing specter of international terrorism head on. Let me park for just a moment and acknowledge someone who is in the audience who doesn't know that I'm going to do this. But this week, I had the awesome privilege of attending a ceremony where we honored the men and women who lost their lives, who gave the ultimate sacrifice as this nation pushed back against terrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan. Will you join me in welcoming and saying hello to General Edwards, who commands our National Guard here in Colorado? And it was my pleasure. General Edwards, see here? There he is. Thank you, General Edwards. Thank you, General Edwards, and I will say once again, it was an honor and a pleasure to share the stage with you as we honored the 92 servicemen and women who lost their lives, from Colorado, who lost their lives in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is again a stark reminder of the importance and the ultimate sacrifice that our young men and women are making to protect this nation, to make sure that what happened on 9/11 never, ever again happens in this United States of America or anywhere else throughout this world. And so we thank our men and women in uniform. As mayor, I have taken considerable measures here in Denver to cooperate with local, state, and national authorities to keep our city safe. This endeavor requires cooperation at all levels, including the need for community engagement. The CEL's new exhibit and educational forums like this continue to bring to light the necessary awareness and education to help this endeavor. I want to thank my good friend, Larry Meisel, my good friend and advisor. He's like the little voice in my ear about doing what's right and doing what is necessary, for putting his resources and his reputation and energy behind what is right. Larry, you represent the very best of what Denver is and the very best of what Colorado is. Thank you for what you've done. Denver is proud that the CEL has become a center of excellence and a nationally recognized leader in terrorism prevention. Tonight, we have the opportunity to engage with one of the nation's top experts and someone who knows firsthand the importance of community involvement in homeland security and beyond, Secretary Michael Chertoff. In a moment, the founder of the CEL, Larry Meisel, will introduce the moderator of this evening's event and other distinguished guests. But before doing that, we will hear from the CEL's founding director, Courtney Meisel, and the executive director, Miss Melanie Perlman. Please give them a hand as they come to the stage, and thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Hancock, for those powerful remarks. I want to extend my sincere appreciation to you and the City of Denver for hosting tonight's program. Since the CEL first opened its doors in 2009, we have witnessed a continued evolution of threats, from homegrown extremists to cyber terrorism and rising tensions in the Middle East. It is clear that terrorism will continue to impact societies both here at home and abroad for generations to come. What is also becoming clear is that our government alone cannot stop its proliferation. It requires the help of educated and engaged individuals like you and me. That is the import of the CEL. The CEL is a nonprofit, nonpartisan institute dedicated to terrorism prevention. We have attracted over 100 U.S. dignitaries and sitting officials, launched the award-winning video recognizing the 8 signs of terrorism, and have hosted 16 symposia featuring a long list of sought-after speakers, including Secretary Napolitano, Secretary Ridge, and now Secretary Chertoff. Our community awareness program, the CAP, will be launched nationally with the International Association of Chiefs of Police this year. We have a number of CAP classes taught by fire and law enforcement that you can register for today at our newly launched website, thecell.org.
The Cell is truly honored to be part of the fabric of public safety and has the privilege to work with extraordinary professionals that dedicate their lives to protecting all of ours. We want to recognize the Denver Post, our premier sponsor, whose support has helped us to attract thousands of new visitors and has broadened our impact in the community. And of course, we appreciate our sponsors, partners, and board of directors for helping us continue to work to achieve our mission. The Cell is fortunate to have such an incredible staff whose work and dedication is really the backbone of our success. I want to recognize here tonight Christina Gradias, our Director of Operations, who really is the backbone. Christina, thank you. Suzanne Sable, who's been with us for the last 3 years, a program coordinator, and a number of new faces, Amy Jacobs, Director of Visitor Services, Catherine Goodman, our communication specialist, and Heather Abba, our database and office administrator. A couple of other key consultants, Zane D. Herrera and David Cohen from Brownstein, Hyatt, and Farber, who couldn't be here with us tonight. And of course, Larry Meisel's assistant, Laura Teal, who's really integral to our success. So thank you.
Please welcome Larry A. Meisel, founder of The Cell.
Thank you, Courtney and Melanie for putting all this together. You guys have done a great job, and Melanie, you've really been special. Thank you. Tonight we have the opportunity to engage with two of our nation's leading security experts and from one of the most respected media moguls in our country. I have the honor of introducing these distinguished gentlemen and friends. I'd like to first introduce the moderator of tonight's discussion, a true leader in the nation, and of course my dear friend Dean Singleton, who has just completed his term as chairman of the board of Associated Press, which he served as 13 years. He is founder and CEO of Media News Group, the second largest newspaper company in the United States. Dean is currently chairman and publisher of the Denver Post and the Salt Lake Tribune, the most premier newspapers in the region. He is not only one of our nation's most brilliant pioneers in the newspaper industry, but as I previously commented, he's a dear friend of all of ours, and I'm very pleased and honored to have Dean here this evening. And next to me, a good friend, one maybe some of you knew from Colorado from the old days. Those of you that heard my comments a little earlier, he was with Brand X when Dean had first acquired the Post. Brand X isn't with us, but Cliff went on to be one of the most important persons really in the intelligence research area in the private sector. He is not only the president, but he's also the founder of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, one of the nation's absolutely most highly regarded institutes. The Daily Telegraph named him one of the 100 most influential conservatives in America. He is a frequent contributor to some of the nation's most respected news programs. Many of you have seen him on TV, on radio, in the print media, and most important, he's a good friend of ours and a good friend of mine, Cliff May. We're very honored tonight to have someone who's really served our country during a most important period of time. Secretary Chertoff is currently chairman of the Chertoff Group, and he was Secretary of Homeland Security from 2005 to 2009. He led the efforts to protect our country from terrorism and the transformation of FEMA into an effective organization. At the Chertoff Group, he provides strategic counsel to a broad range of security issues. He also served as a judge in the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit and as a federal prosecutor. It is a real honor to welcome to Colorado a friend of ours, someone who has been most important to the United States and really to the free world, Secretary Chertoff.
Larry, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And Mr. Mayor, thank you for your wise remarks. It is only a coincidence that both of us turned up wearing bright yellow ties. So obviously we were on the same wavelength here. Larry, I want to compliment you on the cell. I had the opportunity before coming here to speak to look at the exhibit, and it really is a very moving exhibit. Touches all of us personally. One of the things that's important, though, is it's not just an exhibit which you passively absorb, but it is really part of a larger effort to educate and empower citizens so that they can be involved in protecting their own communities. And whether it's dealing with terrorism or natural disasters, I think one of the things we all learn is that our effectiveness in securing our communities depends upon individual effort by every member of the community. You know, it's not a well-known thing, but some of the most significant plots that have been discovered and disrupted by law enforcement have been a result of a tip by a private citizen, somebody who saw something and spoke up and brought it to the attention of the police or the FBI or overseas to the relevant law enforcement authorities. So whether it is being on the lookout for suspicious behavior or helping a neighbor out when there's a natural disaster, individual involvement is the cornerstone of our security, and I think this exhibit and this entire effort is a testament to that. I thought I'd talk very briefly before we get into the panel discussion about what I see as the kind of current state of threats, particularly as it relates to terrorism, as we enter the second decade of the 21st century. We've had some good news in the counterterrorism front. Most recently, of course, the elimination of Osama bin Laden was a welcome arrival of justice for someone who was responsible for the worst atrocity in American history. And I want to pay tribute to everybody who was involved in that, from the president on down to the special operators who went in and did that job in such a magnificent way. I've been lucky over the last 10 years to have worked side by side with some unbelievably noble and heroic people, all of whom have contributed to the reduction of the threat as it originally was presented back in 2001. But the fact that the threat has changed does not mean that it's gone away. And I want to talk briefly about several areas in which I think we're seeing new facets of the threat of terrorism and risk to our security emerging. First, al-Qaeda itself, although they have suffered serious blows against the top leadership over the last 10 years, continues to change and morph and spread around various parts of the world. We not only continue to see it in Afghanistan and in parts of Pakistan, but it's now generally acknowledged that al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, in Yemen, has become the most aggressive threat against the United States, seeking in a number of disruptive plots to actually cause death and destruction here in our own country. We've seen al-Qaeda spread in North Africa. We've seen affiliated groups in Nigeria, in Somalia. Most recently in Mali, extremist groups have now begun to descend from Libya into the northern part of Mali and now threaten the security of that state. In many ways, al-Qaeda, which is an ideology, has become a franchise operation in which the doctrine and the propaganda energize groups that adapt it to their own local circumstances, and some of which treat it as an opportunity to strike back against the United States. So much as I would like to tell you that the end of al-Qaeda is in sight, what I predict for you is that we will see it continue to morph and continue to evolve. The tactics may change, the strategies may change, but it will be incumbent on us to evolve our own defensive and security strategies to meet these new threats. So apart from, if we put aside the fact that if we put aside the fact that bin Laden openly boasted of it, and that we witnessed this with our own eyes, I think we're well past the point of denying that he was responsible for 9/11, just as I think we all really understand I think we also really understand there was actually a landing on the moon. So Al-Qaeda remains as a threat. But I wish I could tell you that was the only threat. But what has been described at times as the A-team of terrorism is not actually Al-Qaeda, but it is Hezbollah. Hezbollah, as you know, is an Iranian-sponsored and backed terrorist organization which has struck against Americans and Israelis and others around the world for decades. It now plays a significant and pivotal role in Lebanon, where it is one of the most effective, if not the most effective, terrorist forces in the world. They have not struck against Americans since 1996, when they were responsible for the Khobar Towers, which were blown up in Saudi Arabia at the loss of lives of many servicemen. But they remain a very significant threat. And as we watch Iran and the tensions between Iran and other countries in the region and around the world continue to increase, monitoring Hezbollah, which operates not only in the Middle East, but in our own hemisphere, will become an increasingly important element of our national security. A little-known fact is this, and I learned this from an Argentinian investigating magistrate who's been looking into for years, been investigating the bombings of Jewish organizations in Buenos Aires in 1994. He told me a couple years ago that in his investigation, he discovered that very soon after the Ayatollah Khomeini took over in Iran, they began to send Iranian operatives into South America in order to build a platform there for potential attacks in the Western Hemisphere. And since then, we've seen Hezbollah continue to increase its presence, most notably because of Chavez in Venezuela, who has now opened up a direct air link with Iran and created a channel for moving personnel and material from Iran into Venezuela in a way that doesn't give us much visibility. Apart from terrorist groups, apart from terrorist... I'm watching some pretty good security right now. Now, I would be incomplete in talking about what we face if I didn't discuss two other phenomena which I think touches very much here in our own country. One is transnational criminal groups. This has actually been a threat that's been developing over the last 20 or 30 years and includes some very powerful international organized groups that are rooted in Central and South America and operate in our own cities. Many of you have heard of MS-13. Many of you have seen in the news reports of some of the activities of the cartels in northern Mexico. Those groups increasingly become sophisticated, and while not politically motivated, one thing we do have to watch is the danger of criminal groups evolving into terrorist groups. This isn't just a fantasy. Some years back, the Colombian Revolutionary Army, the FARC, began to deal with terrorists. They began to deal with drug dealers. And first they began by extorting money from the drug dealers. And next they moved to actually protecting the narcotics traffickers as they conducted their illegal businesses. And finally, the FARC went into the narcotics business itself. More recently, there have been reports that as narcotics are shipped from Venezuela into Europe, the way station is North Africa, and that terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, in return for money, which they use to finance their own activities, provide security and logistical support as the drugs are staged for the final distribution in Europe. So I suggest that as we watch, particularly in our own backyard, We need to pay close attention to the development of these transnational criminal groups and where they might develop ideologically, as well as in terms of their capability, increased capability for violence. Finally, I want to talk just for a couple of minutes about cybersecurity.
Mr. Chertoff,
The,
less people have been killed from terrorism than bee stings. Less people.
Boy, you know, I got to tell you, I mean, anybody, I have to say, anybody who lost loved ones, I guess the guy missed the fact that the bee sting talk was being given somewhere else. So let me talk a little bit about cybersecurity. You've all been reading increasing reports about the kinds of cyber threats that we face. We now live in a world in which much of what operates in our electric grid, in our water, in our hospitals, in our banking system occurs online. And it comes from an infrastructure that was developed through the internet at a time that the presumption was that people who were online were trusted. What we've sadly learned over the last decade, and increasingly as the decade has come to a close, is that there are people who want to exploit the internet. Some of them do it for criminal purposes. Some of them do it to steal our intellectual property and to send it overseas, thereby really robbing us of our economic assets and our economic birthright. And now we even face the danger and the possibility and the risk that terrorists or nation states could decide to attack our industrial control systems and our operating systems in order to gain leverage in an international dispute. Again, this is not a fantasy. In 2007, the country of Estonia was attacked by hackers located in Russia who attempted to bring down the government systems and the banking systems. In 2008, when the Russians invaded Georgia, their military activity was accompanied by online efforts to take out the command and control system in Georgia. So this is the fourth area in which I think we're going to need to devote effort. And again, it's going to involve every single one of us, because the assets and the networks that are at risk are not largely owned by the government, they're largely owned by each of us. Finally, I'd be remiss. Isn't free speech wonderful? Finally, I'd be remiss in light of the events of what's gone on in this state with the fires over the last weeks, not to talk for a little bit about natural disasters and the importance of homeland security as it relates to protecting us from events that are not caused by terrorists or criminals, but that occur in nature. I had the experience over 4 years of seeing pretty much every kind of major natural catastrophe except for earthquakes. And time and again, no matter what the government does, no matter how much we work to invest resources in planning, and all of that is very important, from the very courageous first responders who we've got to thank, all the way up to the President of the United States. In the end, the first response lies with each of us. It's about preparation, it's about planning, it's about cooperation, it's about neighbors helping neighbors. And through that network, working at the family level, at the business level, through the local police and firefighters and EMTs, up to the National Guard and NORTHCOM, and up ultimately to the top leadership in Washington. Through that network, we're able not to eliminate disasters, because we can't stop them, but to respond, to mitigate them, to help those who are in need, and to begin the process of rebuilding. So I'd be remiss in talking about what we face with Homeland Security if I don't remind all of us that even if we could deal with all the terrorist plots and the criminals, we still have forest fires, hurricanes in some parts of the country, flooding and other kinds of disasters. And it's important we continue always to be vigilant and to arm ourselves as individuals with what we need in order to respond and protect our communities. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dean Singleton, chairman and publisher of the Denver Post and your moderator for the evening.
Thank you. First off, the four gentlemen who just left, I wonder, where were they on September the 11th, 2001? I mean, I know. Well, actually, there's one still here. Where the hell were you on September the 11th, 2001? I know where I was, and I know where 3,000 people were. And that's why we're here. So if there's any more of you out there, would you please stand up and get it out of your system? Who the hell can forget September the 11th, 2001? Anyway, thank you, Mr. Secretary, for that excellent overview. I look forward to hearing more from you on a variety of issues as we move forward this evening. And I want to thank Cliff May for his participation here with us this evening, and I want to ask him about an issue that he knows well to begin the dialogue. Tensions have been rising between Iran and the West over Tehran's nuclear energy program, which Iran says is peaceful and Western nations say is a cover for efforts to construct a nuclear weapon. In recent weeks, the U.S. has moved significant military reinforcements to the Persian Gulf in order to deter Iran from shutting the Strait of Hormuz and to have forces in place should the standoff over Iran's nuclear program escalate. Mr. May, in your opinion, how will Iran respond to a buildup of U.S. forces in the Persian Gulf? And do you think there's still time for sanctions to work, or is it futile to think that Iran will curb its nuclear ambitions?
Thank you, Dean. There's a lot to unpack here. Let me try to do it very briefly. First thing I think it's important to say is there's really no debate among reasonable people over whether or not Iran is building a nuclear weapons capability or whether it's building nuclear energy facilities. You don't build nuclear energy facilities deep inside of mountains. You don't go through what they're going through right now in terms of the sanctions in order to have that. If all they wanted was nuclear energy, and don't forget this is one of the countries in the world that has the most oil and natural gas of anywhere, so they don't need it, there would be no problem. We could figure that out, we could work that out, we could have inspections, we could have verification. They could have that if they wanted to. They're building nuclear weapons, that's their goal, and they've been very specific about what they want to use those weapons for. As for the buildup, the U.S. buildup in the Straits of Hormuz and in that area, which is where a great deal of the world's oil goes, the rational calculation from the Iranian point of view would be to do nothing about what the U.S. is doing there. Because if they should attack U.S. forces, the likelihood is very great that this president or any president will very rapidly use our forces in that area to destroy their air defenses, to destroy the military capabilities they have, to do them really very serious damage. So a rational calculation would say they will not do that. But you can't always count on a rational calculation. And the reason why is because there's a very specific ideology that the Iranian regime has. I don't think most of the people of Iran share it. It goes back to the revolution of 1979. In 1979, I was a young foreign correspondent, and I covered that revolution. And I could talk to you for a very long time about the ideology, but I'll give you just what was my first awakening as to it. I was in the holy city of Qum with my producer. I was working on a documentary for Bill Moyer's television show on public TV. And the Ayatollah Khomeini, we were there to see, at least view the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the leader of this revolution. And my Iranian producer, who I would say was a true believer, turned to me and he said, "You're so lucky." And I said, not quite understanding what he meant, I said, "You're right, I am. I'm a young foreign correspondent, and I'm sitting with a front row seat on history. This is very lucky. You're right." And he said, "No, you don't understand, do you? You don't understand. You are lucky because there have only been a few really great men in history. There was Moses, and there was Jesus, and there was Mohammed, and now there is Khomeini, and you are in his glorious presence." Now, this is the ideology you have to begin to understand. You have to understand the ambitions that they have. This revolution was not simply about overthrowing the Shah. It was about overthrowing the West, the Zionist Crusader Empire, as they would call it. It is about much, much more. This is the most dangerous regime in the world in this century, and it's very important we recognize it for what it is.
Secretary Chertoff, do you agree with Cliff's assessment? And if so, what do you think the U.S. will do and when?
Well, I agree that I think it's very hard to assume that an Iranian regime with a nuclear weapon would be subject to the kind of deterrence that we had during the Cold War. Not only because I think the ideological framework and the premises with which they operate are different, but also because I think the opportunity for them to miscalculate what we would do is very high. I think if the regime itself began to feel imperiled by popular discontent, they might decide to use nuclear weapons as a way of shifting attention. I think, frankly, they look at what happened in Libya, and they said, wow, if Gaddafi had kept his nuclear weapons, he'd still be the dictator of Libya, and that enters into their mind. So I think you cannot count on deterrence. You cannot afford to let them have a weapon. Now, will sanctions work? Only recently have we really turned up the sanctions to where there may be a real impact. And I think we'll have to watch and give a little bit of time to see if that works. But I think it would be a big mistake to rely only on sanctions. I think there are a variety of tools that could be used, some of them perhaps secret, some of them perhaps not so secret, that we have to be prepared to deploy in order to prevent this regime from actually getting operational nuclear weapons.
Mr. Secretary, what do you think the role of the Department of Homeland Security is in supporting the U.S. efforts to contain Iran?
I think when you look at any national security issue, it's no single department. It's one of the things I learned from my 4 years is it's really a team approach. Everybody has to be working together. Homeland Security, Department of Defense, Department of Justice, the FBI, state and locals. Everybody plays a different position, but in the end, it has to be coordinated. If, in fact, we got into a circumstance with Iran where it looked like it might move to the level of some form of aggressiveness, obviously, the U.S. military would have the responsibility for what goes on overseas, although I do have to say that we have Coast Guard personnel in the region because the Coast Guard has some very particular capabilities. Now, Admiral Lloyd, who was my military advisor, knows this very well. So they would be in the region, too. But Homeland Security would be concerned about what might the Iranians do here in the United States, and working with the Justice Department, the FBI, and other agencies in state and locals, we'd have to be looking at, does Hezbollah have operatives in the United States? Are there Iranian sympathizers? When we went into Iraq in 2003, there was a well-developed plan for making sure Iraqi agents did not decide to do things in the United States as a way of retaliating or deflecting attention. So I think what you've got to have is a comprehensive plan that looks at security, again, from the farthest area of the Straits of Hormuz down to our local communities.
We're aware of Iran's foiled plans to attack Saudi diplomats on U.S. soil. Is there anticipation of further Iranian terrorists in the U.S. in light of the current tensions? If you were still the Secretary of Homeland Security, what would you do to counter threats from Iran and from to our homeland? And in your opinion, is enough being done about that issue today?
Well, for those who may not have followed the story with a lot of detail, just a 1-minute summary of what happened. Earlier this year, I think it was, the FBI disclosed and uncovered a plot for some Iranian business folks who were trying to reach out to Mexican drug cartels to get them to plant a bomb in Washington to kill the Saudi ambassador to the United States in a restaurant. Happens to be a restaurant I eat at from time to time, so I took a personal interest. Now, it turned out that the so-called drug cartel member that they dealt with was really an informant, and it's a great example of the FBI doing a terrific job. But what struck people was how extraordinary a plot it was. To actually kill the Saudi ambassador in the United States would be an unbelievably provocative act. And I think the first reaction many people had is, it's some crazy guy out on his own, kind of mission. But according to what was disclosed in court documents, the individuals, the Iranians in the US, had connections back to the Quds Force, which is the kind of operational military arm of the religious establishment in Iran. So that while perhaps you can't say that it went to the very top of the Iranian state, this was not just a rogue operation. This was sanctioned by officials in an organization that is at the very core of the regime. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the regime may be prepared to take steps that we would consider irrational and self-defeating, but which they may think are a way of pushing back on us or retaliating against us. And that's to Cliff's point about whether you can really believe they're going to behave rationally. The second thing it tells us is they already believe we're in a struggle with them. They think we are at war with them at some level, and therefore they're prepared to take steps that we would consider acts of war. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. The third thing is that domestic collection of information and intelligence will always be a key element of protecting ourselves against these kinds of plots.
Cliff, you got a point?
Yeah, I want to just make a point of that. The Iranians, this regime in Iran, has believed since 1979 that it's at war with us, and it's been fighting that war. In 1979, if you'll recall, they seized our embassy and held our diplomats hostage. That is an act of war. 4 years later, they dispatched Hezbollah, which Secretary Chertoff correctly said is their proxy overseas terrorist organization, to suicide bomb the Marine barracks in Beirut. More Marines were killed in Beirut in 1983 under Iran's orders than at any point since Iwo Jima. They have been killing Americans by design and facilitating their killing in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, you can say it's not rational for them to try to blow up a restaurant in Washington, D.C., but they've paid no price for that, or for any of these other things. Or, as you mentioned, killing people in Argentina in 1994, killing Iranian expatriates in Europe on a number of occasions. I could go through a whole list. So they have been waging this war. That gets a little bit back to a question I didn't answer about sanctions. Sanctions, and my organization did a lot of research on sanctions at the request of Congress. Most of us do not believe we're going to persuade the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, or Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, to change their mind about nuclear weapons through sanctions. But if you don't have sanctions, you're saying we're going to do business as usual while they are killing Americans and while they are doing all these things. There'll be no punishment for them as the leading sponsor of terrorism in the world. They have been for years, so acknowledged, designated by the State Department, the leading nuclear proliferator, inciter of genocide. All the things they're doing egregiously illegal, we're going to do nothing to them. Now, what sanctions could do is it could help spark another uprising like we saw in 2009 when the people, if you remember, took to the streets yelling, "Death to the dictators." They really would like to throw off this regime. But you can't plan for that. At the very least, by using economic sanctions, we will know at the end of the day that all peaceful means to dissuade this regime or stop this regime from having nuclear weapons will have been tried. And if other means become necessary, at least everything else was attempted.
Okay. The Obama administration has recently stated that all options are on the table to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capability. Cliff, what is the likelihood of Israel acting unilaterally against the Iranian nuclear program in the coming weeks or months? If Israel does decide to conduct a preemptive attack, would the U.S. support its efforts? What type of capabilities would Israel need to launch a successful operation against Iran, and how might Iran respond? That's a mouthful, but it's all one subject.
Let me see if I can do that in 10 seconds. First of all, I think what we can say with assurance is that Israel will not outsource its national security to anybody else, not to those who are friendly or those who are not. The state was set up as a refuge for Jews. They are going to do what they think is necessary. Now, in terms of what they are going to do, anybody who talks about it probably doesn't know. Anybody who knows doesn't talk about it. I think that you have to figure that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his coalition government is looking at all the capabilities they have and deciding what to do and in what time frame to do it. And the one thing you can expect is that if and when they do something, it will not be what you expect them necessarily to do. Now, they are looking at, among other things, we know this, at cyber weapons as well. And the Secretary has rightly said that cyber terrorism is a great threat, but a cyber war is already taking place in the world. It is very important that the U.S. and Israel and other free countries have cyber defenses and cyber offenses that are better than any of their enemies or adversaries. That is absolutely essential. If the Israelis, and the Israelis we believe, and I'm not telling tales out of school because this has been reported, maybe from leaks, but reported, the Israelis have been working closely with the U.S. in some of these cyber capabilities, using U.S. supercomputers and that sort of thing. And the Israelis have very well-developed cyber capabilities. If they can use cyber capabilities, they will do so. But they will look at a range of things, and I think the expectation is that if they do something, you will say that's not exactly the way it was expected. I would hope that, first of all, I don't think Iran should be Israel's primary responsibility. It's the responsibility of the leader of the free world, because this is a regime that is fighting a war against all of us. Ali Larijani, who is the Speaker of the Majlis, the Parliament, said last week, very threateningly, it is time for the disappearance of America and Israel. He said both together. So we shouldn't outsource this problem either. If the Israelis do decide to act in their own self-defense against a regime that has threatened them with genocide, I would hope that the U.S. would give strong backing to that.
But in your opinion, will Israel do a preemptive attack?
I think the Israelis will not allow this regime to get nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons capability if they can prevent that, and they will take considerable risks to achieve that.
And will the United States be right there with them?
I'm certainly hopeful that we will.
But will they?
I think Casey Stengel said, it's dangerous to make predictions, especially about the future.
Secretary.
I think that was Yogi Berra.
That was Yogi Berra. I always get those confused.
Sorry.
Mr. Secretary, will Israel do a preemptive attack?
I don't think I can add to what Cliff said. I don't think anybody knows. I mean, they're going to have to judge the point at which they hit the level, the line of no return. And I think if they didn't believe that there was an alternative, I think they would do it. But we've yet to see what happens in Iran, both in terms of sanctions and in terms of internal dynamics. You know, who would have thought 6 months before what happened in Egypt in the spring of last year that Mubarak would wind up being on trial? So there are a lot of uncertainties, but you have to prepare for all the options.
Also last week, something happened you may not have seen, but it's important. There was an Iranian-conducted poll that showed, that 63% of Iranians are saying, we would like to get rid of this nuclear weapons program and get rid of the sanctions as well. It was up on an Iranian website very briefly before it was pulled down. And whoever put that up on the website, I don't think they're having as pleasant an evening tonight as we are. But a very clever journalist took screenshots of it, so we know it did exist. And so what we now know is that the apologists for the Tehran regime, who have said for years the people are foursquare in favor of this nuclear program, they have now been proven conclusively wrong based on a poll that the regime itself ordered.
And Mr. Secretary, when Israel does make that preemptive attack, will our country be with them?
I can't, I'd be speculating about it. The real issue, I think, in many ways is this. If the Israelis were to attack, would the Iranians regard that as something in which they would limit their response to Israel, or would engulf not only Israel but the United States and, frankly, the countries in the region? Don't forget the most immediate threat the Iranians pose is to the countries that are on the other side of the Persian Gulf. And a couple years ago, after I left office, I was in Bahrain at a conference, and the Iranians, out of the blue, announced that Bahrain is their province. And then they sent the Minister of Interior over to the conference to tell everybody this fact. So they might very well decide their response would be not limited at all, but would be a widespread response.
Okay, let's shift a little bit to the Arab Spring. In the last several months, there's been a sea change in politics and policy in North Africa and the Middle East. Secretary Chertoff, has the Arab Spring spawned any new security threats for the United States?
So there's a story Henry Kissinger tells that back in the 70s when he met with the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, he said to him, you know, Premier Zhou, looking back now on the Chinese Revolution, which was, you know, some 40 years before, how do you evaluate the Chinese Revolution? And Zhou said, it's too soon to tell. And so then Kissinger said, well, what about the French Revolution? And Zhou Enlai said, too soon to tell. So I think that's kind of my reaction to the Arab Spring. We really don't know how this is going to turn out. It certainly upends the established order. You can certainly hope that through a democratic transformation, you'll get rule of law, you'll get increased prosperity, you'll get an elimination of some of the arbitrariness that characterized some of the regimes, and that'll be a positive development. And I guess if you look at Tunisia, people would pick that as a place where it looks like things are developing in a positive way. On the other hand, things could take a turn for the worst. Literally on a day-by-day basis with Egypt, we don't know which way this is headed. Is it going to be better or worse for the people? Is it going to be better or worse for the neighbors? Is it going to be better or worse for us? Clearly, we have a strategic interest in Egypt. I would argue in some ways our biggest strategic interest is Syria. Because in Syria, what we deal with is not only whether this incredibly brutal regime is going to be removed, but we're now seeing a surrogate conflict between Iran, which has been a sponsor of Assad, and Hezbollah, and some of the Gulf states, and Turkey, who are basically supporting the Free Syrian Army. And how this plays out will either empower Iran or be damaging to Iran, and that's going to affect the position of Hezbollah in the region. That's going to affect the security of Israel, the security of Jordan, the security of the Gulf states. So of all the things we've seen in the Middle East, in terms of the, quote, Arab Spring, that which I think is most directly tied to our national security interest is what's going on in Syria.
Cliff, how has the Arab Spring affected America's relations with the countries in and the people of the Middle East?
Well, we're in a sort of limbo at this point where I think we're struggling with what to do in each of these cases. Do we continue to supply aid to Egypt, or do we not supply aid to Egypt? We have in the President Mohammed Morsi, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, who, by the way, would agree with the members of the pro-terrorism community who were so graciously invited here tonight, that 9/11 was an inside job. This is going to be a problem. The military is nothing admirable, but they are going to say you need to continue to support us if you want us to have some sort of rational government in this country. We're going to have to look differently on Tunisia, where things have not been as bad. Libya actually is, for the moment at least, rather promising. We're going to see some real differences between the Muslim brotherhoods of different places, which is not to say that any of them are moderate. Some of them are more pragmatic than others. So I think right now we have this, we're trying to feel our way and figure out what's going on, and I don't think people at the highest levels necessarily know. I think the Secretary is quite right that over time, if you have free elections and if you have other freedoms as well, free speech, freedom of religion, things could go in a good direction. On the other hand, I've been going to Pakistan since the early 1980s. They've had many elections there. It is not going in a good direction. It is going in a very bad direction despite these elections. So look, I think we're in a very difficult place at this point in this century. We're turning a windy corner of history, as a member of Congress told me some time ago. And I think we're going to have to be very vigilant, and we're going to have to be very watchful, and we have a lot of dangerous times ahead.
Yeah, could I add something? Because I think Cliff brought up Pakistan, which I think is a really important point. You know, Pakistan has nuclear weapons, and it has been a democracy, but I would agree with Cliff. I think it's proceeding in a very dangerous direction. What you're seeing is the disempowering of the elected government, which is not by any means a Jeffersonian model, and you know, there's issues of corruption and nepotism and favoritism that are very problematic. But what we're now seeing is various groups in the Pakistani national security establishment proceeding on their own agendas, some of them more pro-American, some of them, frankly, enabling groups that kill Americans. We're seeing the judiciary not acting the way judges do, the way we expect them to, but getting very politically involved in trying to overturn the government because of a grievance between the Chief Justice and the current president. And where all this could lead is to a fragmented state which is in possession of actual nuclear weapons. And I would have to say, you know, when we talk about Iran, I would consider the situation in Pakistan a close second in terms of things I would keep an eye on with a direct impact on our own security.
Okay, let's move a little bit to energy security. Some say that our dependence on foreign oil compromises our national security. Mr. Secretary, the United States has worked to improve its energy security by increasing domestic oil production and fostering new alternative energy initiatives. There have been some setbacks, however, such as the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. How does the United States balance its need for energy security with the economic and environmental consequences of accidents like the BP oil spill? The Department of Homeland Security plays a critical role in two ways here: the response to the spill and the broader concerns of securing the associated energy infrastructure. Is the DHS doing enough in both instances?
So, I mean, I think that the value from a security standpoint of having a stable form of energy production in this country obviously is not only that it makes us less dependent on threats to oil production overseas or the transit of oil across the sea lanes, but it has a very significant effect on our overall economy, which obviously has a security benefit. DHS is not the regulator, doesn't set the terms and conditions. Obviously, you have to balance between two extremes. One extreme is pump everything without regard to any safety or environmental concerns. Same thing goes with nuclear power. You know, you could just, you know, build without regard to the potential hazards. Or at the other extreme, you can say we're not going to do anything. And then we won't have environmental problems, but we'll be all freezing our you-know-whats off in the winter or sweating in 100-degree heat in Washington. So we clearly have to be in the middle. The two areas where DHS operates in this domain are these. One is, at least with a certain category of spills, the Coast Guard does play the role as the principal agency in spill response. And I think people will go back and look at what happened with BP and ask, you know, they always ask, should the government have played a larger role? The typical model has been to let the operator, which has the technical expertise, play the lead role under the supervision and direction of the federal authorities. I think people will be reevaluating that, although I don't know whether in this budget environment we can afford to build up a federal capability to do spill response. The second level is how do we make sure that there's no attack on our security, on our energy infrastructure? And there I would say, I don't think we worry so much about a physical attack, because we have pretty good security measures. I do think we need to look carefully at cybersecurity. We do know that there are control systems in our energy sector and other sectors of our economy which are wired to the internet. And that means if someone can get past the firewall or somehow insert something into the network, they could affect the ability of that to operate, and that could have environmental consequences. And that's why I think cyber is kind of at the top of my list of things which need to be urgently addressed by this country.
Can I make one point on energy, or maybe two quick points, but they're important. One is oil is a strategic commodity. The Western way of life depends on it. It is vitally important, and it has been for a very long time. Hitler told his generals, if we don't get access to the oil of the Caspian Basin, we will lose this war. That's what the Battle of Stalingrad was all about. It wasn't about Hitler wanting to build a villa in Stalingrad. He wanted that oil. Why did we fight in North Africa even before that? It was over oil. And you can make a very plausible case that the Nazis lost the war because they didn't have oil. In fact, in the Pacific as well, we were denying the Japanese oil. and they couldn't train their fighters, and that's why they couldn't. That's why we were able to do what we were able to do in the skies. That's one of the reasons they had kamikazes. Right now, if you ask yourself, where is Al-Qaeda getting its money? It's from the sale of oil in some way. Iran's only important product, a few pistachio nuts maybe, oil, 80% of its economy. We are fighting a war, and we are funding both sides in this war. So it is absolutely necessary that oil becomes no longer a strategic commodity, but simply one of many competing energy sources. Now, one of the things that is helping our country right now is the fracking revolution. Hydraulic fracturing is allowing us to bring a lot of natural gas, but all of this won't help until we can put more liquid fuels into our automobiles. This is not science fiction. It can be done right now, but we need to move very quickly to have a variety of liquid fuels so that the Iranians and the Saudis and others have to sell their fuel in a competitive market, and every time there's tension in the Middle East, the price of oil doesn't go up to a premium, which it does now, and in fact it stays at a premium because of the tension. And Russia and others, including Iran, anytime they want the price of oil to go up, all they have to do is increase the tension, and they get more for their product. It's a hugely important part of this war. We will not win this war so long as so much of the energy we need for our transportation system, just for that, not for other things, for our transportation system, comes from regimes that are hostile to us.
Thank you. Let's move a little bit to border security. One of the ways in which DHS works to improve our nation's border security is by pushing some of its activities into foreign countries. For example, the Security Container Initiative is a program where U.S. and partner country customs officials work together to examine high-risk maritime containerized cargo at foreign seaports before the containers are loaded on board vessels bound for the United States. Mr. Secretary, in your opinion, is this an effective policy? Should it include more than just cargo coming into the United States? And are we doing enough to secure the land borders with our neighboring countries to the north and to the south?
Well, I think first of all, it has been effective to work with partners overseas to push the screening process out earlier in the supply chain. And we do it not only in cargo, but when I was secretary and the current secretary, Janet Napolitano, has continued this, we worked out arrangements with countries in terms of pre-screening passengers before they get on airplanes, which is both a security benefit and also avoids the problem of somebody getting on a plane, showing up and being turned back at the border and having to fly back again. So I think this has evolved, and it's actually a good thing. In terms of the land borders, we have put a lot of, crossing the northern border between the ports of entry has typically not been a large flow of illegal immigrants. There have been issues about terrorists coming through the ports of entry. We've been pretty tough about the requirements for crossing from Canada through the ports of entry. We put in requirements for secure documentation. To be candid, the Canadians got a little irritated with me about this, but they've accommodated to it, and it has resulted in a real benefit to the security of the country. Southern border people tend to look more at what's going on between the ports of entry. And there I have to say, if you look at the statistics, over the last 6 or 7 years, for the first time, we're beginning to see a reversal of momentum and fewer people coming across, and the numbers are now getting, I think they're now lower than they were since 1970. Some of that is probably the economy, but candidly, some of it is the investment we've made over 7 years since I was secretary in increasing the infrastructure, the number of Border Patrol agents, and the technology at the border. And the current secretary is doing the same thing. I mean, she's building on this. So I think this is, again, I don't want to tell you the job is done, but the move is in the correct direction.
Thank you. We've heard a lot about Homeland Security issues and on several topics, but let me ask you this. Given the threats faced by the United States, and the threats that are constantly changing, what do you see as the biggest threat we face going forward?
Let me divide this into two parts. One is, what is the most likely in the next short-term period of time? And I would have to say to you, and we've seen this, and we've had some near misses in the last couple of years, I think a terrorist putting a bomb in a mall or a bus station or taking a gun like Nidal Hassan did in Fort Hood and killing people, I think that is the most likely thing we will see over the next few years. As I said, we had a close call in Times Square. I think the enemy is continuing to try to find ways to do that. Now, is that an existential threat to the U.S.? No, although a series of attacks like that could start to have some real damaging impact on the economy. If I look at high consequence threats, not things that are necessarily going to happen next month, but that in the next 5 years could happen and would be enormously damaging to the U.S., there are two things I worry about. One is a biological attack. We had a biological attack in this country. We had anthrax in 2001. The reason more people didn't get killed is that the perpetrator of the attack chose to deliver the anthrax, which was highly weaponized, in a way that limited the number of people who would be exposed. He sent them through the mail. If that person had dumped the anthrax in the New York subway system, you would have seen a lot more people get killed, and you would have seen an unusable New York subway system. The raw material to make biological weapons exists in nature. All you need is the know-how. So I worry about that, and I think we've made some steps to prepare, but I think often we are plagued in this country by the characteristic that if something hasn't happened before, we don't get serious until it happens. And this is a case where one bite at the apple is really dangerous. The second area, as I've talked about already, is cyber, where I think both in terms of our intellectual property and our control systems, we need to make a lot more progress in building defense capabilities. And this is an area where every individual and everybody who runs a business is going to have to take some responsibility, because we're all linked together and we're only as strong as the weakest link.
I'm going to agree with all that, but I'm going to answer your question in a slightly different way and say there are two things that really worry me. And one is a failure of imagination on our part, the inability to foresee what the bad guys might want to do. Look, there was a blue ribbon commission on aviation safety just a few years before 9/11. They looked at all sorts of things that never occurred to anybody on this commission, of very smart people, I could tell you their names, and you'd know them, to say, you know what, somebody could use a plane as a missile and bring down a major building. They didn't think of that, even though people were using motorcycles and cars and boats. All of that had been used as delivery vehicles for terrorists. Nobody said, what if they used an airplane? Nobody said that. It's a failure of imagination. We are not exercising our imagination the way our enemies are. And here's the second thing I would say that I worry about, that we will lose the will to defend ourselves, our culture, our nation, our civilization, that we will choose appeasement, that we will choose the kind of delusion you heard from those people who went out of the room, that we will think that there is some way in which we can make ourselves inoffensive to our enemies. And let me tell you, because I've known this since 1979, we cannot. Weakness is provocative. We will need to be strong, and we will need to value what we have if we want to preserve it. Because Ronald Reagan said that in every generation you have to fight for freedom. What he didn't say, but which is also true in the corollary, is that in every generation evil reinvents itself in a new way. So you had the Nazis who believed that the Aryans must rule, and you had the communists who believed the proletarians must rule, and now you have a group who say, you know, Muslims must rule, and we must rule according to our laws, and everyone is going to give way. We must believe in ourselves.
Let me ask this question for each of you, and starting with the Secretary. Which is the greater threat, domestic terrorism or foreign terrorism?
Well, you know, people separate them, but actually what the foreign terrorists are trying to do now is recruit American citizens and permanent residents and turn them into terrorist operatives. So I have a difficulty sometimes finding the line. And by the way, the kind of person who is got the mindset to become a terrorist can gravitate to one or another of the ideologies. And sometimes it's just the happenstance of where they happen to be roaming around on the internet. Right now, in terms of capability and experience, international terrorists are ahead of domestic terrorists. I mean, they've had 10 years to hone their skills on how to build improvised explosive devices. Until we went into Afghanistan, they were experimenting with biological and chemical weapons. And they have more money and more resources, and they do get support from, for example, the Iranians. And that makes them a more formidable opponent. But the hard thing for them is getting into the US. And what they are trying to do is take their know-how and somehow get it over to Americans that they can recruit to have those Americans be the delivery mechanism. And that's, I think, where you have the most danger.
And I would structure it just slightly differently, Dean, and say that the terrorism we have to worry most about is terrorism and terrorist organizations that have state sponsorship. Groups that don't have state sponsorship have difficulty organizing, fundraising, getting into laboratories where they can make biological weapons, doing sophisticated cyber warfare. All of that is very difficult. You can't stop somebody easily from coming into this room and spraying it with gunfire or an improvised bomb. That can happen. But the kind of catastrophic terrorism that I think we really have to be concerned about, that requires some state sponsorship. That requires terrorists to have safe haven where they can work in peace and develop their cyber weapons, their biological weapons, their chemical weapons, their very intricate plots. It doesn't have to be a very sophisticated country. Al-Qaeda was able to do this in Afghanistan, which was and remains a pretty primitive place. But if we can stop state sponsorship of terrorism, it's a different level of problem than if nation states are providing the passports, the funds, the letters of transit, and the weaponry.
I slightly have a different take on it, which is it's not just state sponsorship. What we see now, which did not exist 20 or 30 years ago, is the existence of safe havens in failed states. These are countries like Somalia, now perhaps part of Mali, Yemen, where the central government is either weak or unwilling to really enforce the rules. You can't go so far as to say they're state sponsors. They're not necessarily funding the terrorists. But what they are is they're leaving an open field. And the terrorists have the ability then to use that safe space in order to build their tools of destruction. And that's what has changed in the last 20 years, whether it's the frontiers of Pakistan or parts of Afghanistan or Yemen or Mali or Somalia, is areas where there is no lawful authority. And no one has the will or the capability to police them. And that's why when we get into discussions about what the U.S. role ought to be and whether we should be using lethal means to deal with these problems if the country itself can't deal with it.
Let me close with one last question for each of you. And you can think about it as I'm asking it. The first Homeland Security Office was established by President Bush after 9/11. You weren't the first secretary, but you were the second secretary in that administration. We got a new president, and President Obama, and he appointed Governor Napolitano to head Homeland Security. And so we've seen how it worked under President Bush. We've now seen how it's worked under President Obama. We have an election in November. As those of us who go to the polls go in to pick the president for the next 4 years, see if you can contrast how Homeland Security would look under another 4 years of President Obama versus how it would look under President Romney.
Actually,
Cliff, you can start first.
Look, I think there are a lot of differences between a second Obama administration and a second Romney administration. This may be the least of them. I was privileged to have lunch with Secretary Napolitano earlier this week. She has great admiration for you, as you know. You like her as well. She is very clear that she has been building on the foundation that you and Secretary Ridge had. When you talk about Homeland Security, it's not necessary, and you know this much better than I, so I should leave this to you. It's not that part. There are partisan issues, but this is least of all, I think, a partisan issue. The Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, there's a lot of things, but not this one. We're looking at best practices, and Secretary Chair to put in place a lot of best practices. What is the highest percentage of risk, and how do we focus most resources on that rather than a lower one? There's no disagreement among professionals in Homeland Security on these things.
I have to really strongly agree with that. I mean, I've known Secretary Napolitano for years. We were U.S. attorneys together, and she's done a really fine job. And what has been notable about this is it has not been a partisan or political difference in approaches. There's been a lot of continuity, and I think it reflects the fact that when you sit in the position and have responsibility to make sure that really devastating things don't happen, it really focuses the mind, to quote, paraphrase Dr. Johnson, and people start to, really focus on what actually works pragmatically. And there's also a large group of career folks who are very, very dedicated to this. So to me, actually, I think a really good news story in the 10 years the department has existed. And, it's had bumps in the roads, and there are things people don't like and things people do like. But it has not been a political issue, by and large. It's been a kind of a continuity of approach and an agreement on the importance of the objective that I actually think ought to make Americans feel good about it. And that also, I think, has generally been the case at levels between the federal, state, and local government. So my sense is that obviously there are always some policy differences on issues like immigration, but on the core of Homeland Security, I suspect that you're going to see a lot of continuity no matter who the president is.
Mr. Secretary, from that awful day on 9/11, thanks to Homeland Security, and thanks so much for you. For your tenure, America has been safe, and we've continued to be safe. And we know the very minute we let up our guard, we might not be safe. So thanks for what you've done to keep us safe, and thanks for all who worked with you. And let's all pray that for the rest of our lives and the lives of our kids, we continue to be safe.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for moderating.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.